The lander touched down on Thalus X with a soft hiss, expelling waves of heat from its undercarriage vents as it settled onto the desert surface. Through the reinforced observation panel, Aaron Salazar saw nothing but an endless expanse of ochre sand stretching in every direction. The horizon shimmered with thermal distortion, and the sun, larger and whiter than Earth's, hovered above like an unblinking eye. There were no clouds, no shade, no signs of vegetation or water, just heat, wind, and silence. She remained seated while the other cadets began to stir. Her gloved hands adjusted the light-filtering scarf around her neck, and she double-checked the contents of her side pouch. A folded sheet of thermal foil, a coil of translucent tubing, 4 anchoring clips, and a tightly compressed square of absorbent cloth. Basic materials. Primitive maybe, but she trusted them. She had brought them not out of nostalgia but necessity. One of the cadets to her left, a lanky figure with jointed limbs and blue-tinted skin, stood and stretched, clicking the joints in his exoskeleton. His glossy eyes scanned the sand outside with mild disapproval. "This place is a moisture trap. Useless. Who designed this assignment?" he muttered in his own dialect before switching to trade common. "Bet the human lasts 6 hours." He gave her a side glance but didn't wait for a response. Aaron didn't bother replying. She knew how it always began. Mockery followed by overconfidence. Then the inevitable collapse. She had seen it before on volcanic terrain during the Vakari heat simulations, and again during the ammonia fog drills on Luther 3. Each time, the others underestimated her because she didn't wear mechanical cooling gear or hydrosuits. But she had learned something in her first month off Earth. Humans didn't need to dominate the environment. They needed to understand it. The debriefing began the moment the ship's outer ramp descended. A holographic instructor, a non-corporeal entity modeled in the shape of a neutral biped, flickered into view on the sand. Its voice came through the implants in each cadet's ear canal, a direct transmission that bypassed language filters. "Welcome to Trial 7 Arid Survival," the voice said. "Thalus X offers no surface water, no artificial hydration nodes, and no shaded zones. The temperature will rise by 12 degrees centigrade per hour until midday, then plateau at peak heat before a rapid nocturnal drop. You will receive no resupply, no communication access, and no assistance. Trial duration, 48 standard hours. Objective, endure." The hologram dissolved into particles of light, leaving only silence. Aaron walked down the ramp, boots sinking slightly into the soft top layer of sand. The heat was already noticeable, clinging to her like static. The others disembarked in staggered waves, some bounding across the sand, with the springy confidence of species adapted to low gravity or dry climates. A spherical cadet from the Zaleri cluster uncoiled a hydroskin membrane over her frame. Another cadet, tall and iridescent, unfolded a heat-reflective parasol from his back exopack. Aaron chose a direction opposite the others. She walked toward a series of low dunes, pausing only when she reached the crest of a rise that gave her a modest vantage point. From there, she surveyed the landscape. No craters, no caves. The wind followed a consistent easterly pattern, bending the tops of the dunes into sharp ridges. It wasn't much, but it was enough to begin. She dropped her rucksack and pulled out the thermal foil, unfolding it with deliberate movements. It crackled softly in the air, catching flashes of the sun. Using the clips and a few jagged stones she had picked up during her walk, she began securing the corners of the foil in a shallow bowl shape, angled slightly downward. Then she placed the absorbent cloth beneath the foil, staked in place, and positioned the tubing to channel any condensation that might collect overnight. It wouldn't yield much. But in an environment like this, a few drops could mean everything. While she worked, a few cadets wandered nearby. One of them, a bird-like humanoid with golden feathers and 3 narrow eyes, paused and tilted his head in her direction. "That looks like Earth camping gear," he said, voice dry and amused. "You planning to roast marshmallows while we dehydrate?" She glanced up and gave a single nod. "I'll roast marshmallows when the sun goes down." He chuckled and walked off, muttering something in his native tongue. As the others spread out across the desert, most of them built temporary shelters, lean-to structures made of composite panels or mirrored tarps designed to reflect heat. Some activated thermal resistance fields using the last of their portable power reserves. One cadet even tried to burrow into the sand for insulation, only to retreat moments later when the scalding underlayers burned his hands. Aaron didn't bother with a shelter. She crouched beside her setup, adjusting angles and tightening the foil center so that droplets would slide more easily toward the tubing. Then she sat on her pack and pulled her scarf over her face, creating a pocket of breathable air. Her eyes remained on the horizon, watching the slow passage of the sun. Every hour, she recorded the temperature on a manual strip reader and made notes on the cloth beside her. Her survival wasn't going to depend on luck or instinct. It would come from rhythm, from watching the signs, from letting the land speak first. By late afternoon, the first signs of fatigue showed in the others. The cadet with the parasol had collapsed beside his structure, mouth open, eyes bloodshot. His hydration system had failed. The Zalari cadet's membrane had begun to shrivel, indicating critical fluid loss. Several others called out across the dunes, hoping to make contact, but received only echo in return. Erin stood and moved to a new dune with a clearer view of the western sky. She noted the wind shift. It had dropped slightly, but the air was still moving. That meant overnight cooling would likely bring atmospheric condensation. She retrieved a second sheet of foil from her rucksack and began assembling a smaller trap, this one with a steeper incline and tighter cloth core. She worked slowly, preserving energy, and drank nothing. At sunset, the color of the sand deepened into dark gold, and the first true silence settled over the field. One by one, the cadets stopped moving. The temperature had stabilized, but the real challenge had only begun. Most of them had used up their water capsules during the first few hours, expecting a hidden reservoir or a supply drop. There would be none, not here, not on Thalus X. Erin sat beside her trap as the stars emerged above. The night would be cold, but she was prepared for that. She wrapped her arms around her knees and watched the condensation begin to form, a delicate shimmer of moisture on the foil surface. It would take hours for the droplets to gather enough to slide. But they would. She was patient. The others were stronger, faster. Some had advanced biology. Some had internal filtration systems or temperature-resistant organs. But only she had learned how to read the land like a book. And as she leaned her head back against her pack and let the sky stretch open above her, she smiled slightly under her scarf. She didn't need to outlast the desert. She only needed to listen to it. The desert did not wake gently. At dawn, the first breath of light crept across the ridges, like a pale hand reaching to grasp the land. It brought with it not warmth but warning. The night chill receded in minutes, and the still air surrendered to the furnace of Thalus X's rising sun. Erin stirred beneath her scarf as her eyelids blinked open. Her joints were stiff, but her thoughts sharp. She sat up slowly, careful not to disturb the foil traps around her, and glanced at the shallow basin she had arranged the night before. Her eyes narrowed as she leaned closer. On the inside of the plastic tubing, she spotted movement, slow, deliberate droplets sliding down, converging into a bead of water no larger than a fingernail. Her breath caught. It wasn't much, but it was real. She tapped the tube lightly and guided the bead into a tiny catch vial she had wedged between two stones. Another drop followed, then another, in total just under 5 milliliters, enough for a few sips. She sat back, her muscles aching from the cold. But she didn't reach for the water yet. She knew better. It had to last. She capped the vial and stored it in the fold of her jacket, close to her chest where the heat would not cause unnecessary evaporation. Down the slope, the first scream broke the stillness. She turned her head sharply, standing quickly and shielding her eyes with one hand. One of the cadets, the Zalari with the gel-lined limbs, was writhing in the sand. Her hydration membrane had fully collapsed during the night. Her body, designed for marshy, fog-rich climates, was not built for hard desiccation. The crystalline lines along her side had cracked. Her breathing was erratic. She tried to sit up, but her limbs buckled. No instructors came. The automated drones floated in a wide circle above the test zone, silent and watching, their glass eyes reflecting the sunlight. They were programmed to record, not intervene. Erin watched for a moment longer, then moved swiftly toward her pack. She pulled out the remaining foil sheet and grabbed a thin length of cord she had twisted from her ration bag the previous day. She ran across the sand with deliberate steps, conserving energy with each stride. When she reached the Zalari, she crouched beside her and gently lowered her back to the sand. "Don't talk," she said quietly. "Breathe shallow. You're not losing heat yet, just moisture." The Zalari groaned, her tongue swollen, her eyes milky. Erin reached into her jacket and retrieved the vial, uncapping it with care. She let 2 drops fall onto the cadet's tongue and waited. The body convulsed slightly, but the reaction faded into stillness. Erin knew it was barely enough, but it might buy her time. She returned to her camp and started digging. The sun was rising quickly now, and every minute shaved another layer of moisture from the body. She worked quickly, carving a trench half a meter deep and setting the foil into a slanted shape. Then she placed a stone at the center, weighing it down to form a low point, and lined the pit with absorbent cloth. She didn't have more tubing, so she would need to manually collect whatever formed beneath the surface. By mid-morning, the heat had become unbearable. The air shimmered in waves. The sand hissed underfoot. From her vantage point, she saw one of the feathered cadets crawling in circles, his long arms flailing. His feathers, once vibrant, were charred at the edges. He collapsed face down and did not rise. Another figure, tall, scaled, with heavy eye shields, staggered toward the eastern rocks. He moved erratically, stripping off a reflective vest as if trying to breathe through his skin. He collapsed near a cracked boulder and began scratching at the ground, whispering to himself in a guttural tongue. Erin turned away. She focused on tightening the lines around her largest collector. She knew the next few hours would be the worst. Survival wasn't about reacting to pain. It was about not making mistakes when the mind began to fray. She kept her movements slow, her breathing steady, and her thoughts on systems, not symptoms. By noon, the sand had turned pale and almost white from the sun. Her clothing stuck to her skin. Her lips were cracking, and her fingers trembled as she worked. But her traps were functioning. She checked the deepest basin and was rewarded with a modest pool, perhaps 10 milliliters, enough for another sealed vial. She didn't drink. Not yet. She heard movement behind her. Turning her head, she saw the Zalari cadet crawling slowly toward her camp. Her breathing was labored, but her limbs moved with direction now, not panic. Erin knelt and helped her sit, then unsealed the vial again. 3 drops, enough to coat the inside of the throat, to remind the body it could recover. The cadet blinked once, then twice, and whispered something in a soft, high-pitched tone. Erin didn't understand the words, but the cadence sounded like thanks. A rustling came from the top of the dune. Erin turned sharply. The golden-feathered cadet who had mocked her the day before stood there, hunched, his wings dragging, his face sunburned. He stared at her setup in disbelief. You made water," he croaked. "With trash." Erin said nothing. He descended slowly, knees shaking, and knelt beside the basin. He looked as if he might reach for it, but paused. His eyes met hers. He didn't ask for permission, but he didn't take anything either. Erin looked down at her pack. She had enough material for one more trap. Maybe. She stood, picked up the remaining strips of cloth, and held them out to him. He blinked and took them with both hands, his claws careful not to tear the fabric. He looked lost. She pointed toward the opposite slope. "Dig shallow, angle the cloth, use stones to weigh the corners. Let the wind work." He nodded once, then stumbled off. By late afternoon, the others had started to notice. A few cadets, those still conscious, began crawling or dragging themselves toward Erin's side of the basin. They didn't speak. They only watched. 1 or 2 tried to mimic her design, folding foils and stringing cords across hollowed ground. The results were poor. The angles were wrong. The traps collapsed in the heat or let moisture evaporate before it could condense. Erin helped no one directly. She gave no speeches. She didn't command. But her actions had become visible. Visible enough that others began copying, adjusting, learning. The sun dipped slightly in the sky, and the temperature dropped by 1 degree. She opened her smallest vial and took her first sip. It was warm, slightly metallic, but her throat welcomed it like a gift. She sat quietly beside the pit, watching the last hour of sunlight slip across the dunes, and noted how many cadets had made it through the day. Fewer than half, but some were watching the wind now, and that meant some would survive. The stars emerged as sharp, crystalline points against a black sky stretched taut over the desert. Erin sat motionless beside her primary dew trap, legs crossed and arms folded across her knees. Her scarf covered the lower half of her face to conserve moisture, and her eyes flicked between the foil's glistening slope and the horizon. The temperature had dropped dramatically, faster than she'd expected, causing the upper layer of sand to harden into a brittle crust that cracked beneath the slightest movement. Every breath now curled from her nostrils like fog and faded instantly. She leaned closer to the basin and watched. A droplet formed, hesitated on the edge of the foil, then fell into the catchcloth below with the faintest sound. She smiled faintly. A second followed, then a third. Each was deliberate, silent proof that the atmosphere, so brutal in daylight, was quietly generous at night if approached correctly. Behind her, the golden-feathered cadet worked in silence. He had managed to copy her trap with mixed success, placing his foil too steep at first, which caused the condensation to scatter and evaporate before reaching the container. But he had adjusted. Erin had not spoken to him directly since handing him the cloth, but she had noticed his changes, how he mirrored the shallow angles of her trap, how he had dug his basin slightly deeper with flattened stones instead of claws. He was learning without asking. A shuffling sound caught her attention. The Zalari cadet approached again, dragging a piece of scorched fabric behind her. Erin rose and moved to intercept her before she could step into the dew zone. She guided her gently by the arm and lowered her beside the older pit. Her condition had stabilized. Her limbs no longer shook, and her eyes had cleared somewhat. She whispered something again, the same phrase as before. Erin didn't understand her language, but she sensed its meaning more clearly now. It wasn't just thanks, it was recognition of something shared, something vital. She handed the cadet the smallest vial, which now contained 5 drops of water. The cadet accepted it without hesitation and cupped it between her long fingers like it was sacred. She sipped once, then closed her eyes and leaned against the edge of the pit, letting the cold air wash over her. The wind shifted slightly. Erin stood following its change. It came from the north now, drier but more consistent. She adjusted the angle of one foil sheet to face the breeze more directly, hoping to capture the subtle thermal contrast that encouraged condensation. As she did, she heard footsteps crunching on the hard sand. More than one set. She turned and saw 2 figures approaching, one tall, one low to the ground. The tall one was a scaled reptilian cadet with a ridged back and narrow slits for eyes. His chest heaved with effort, and he held a cracked filtration mask in one claw. The smaller figure behind him resembled a shelled quadruped with 2 wide-set eyes and a trembling gait. Neither looked stable. The reptilian cadet stopped at the perimeter of the trap and said nothing. His jaw trembled. He looked at the foil, then at Erin, then down at the sand. He didn't ask. Erin walked to her pack and retrieved the last of her salvaged cloth and a small strip of adhesive resin. She held them out. The reptilian cadet blinked twice, then he knelt slowly and began to dig. The quadruped lowered himself nearby and simply lay still. She crouched beside them both and drew a quick diagram into the sand. 2 arrows for airflow, a slope, a center point. The reptilian nodded once. Then he began to mimic the shape with clumsy but determined claws. She stayed beside him for a few minutes, watching him adjust the angle with his scales scraping rock. It was enough. She returned to her station and checked the largest basin. The cloth inside had darkened with moisture, enough for nearly 15 milliliters this time. She used the tubing to draw the liquid into a fresh vial and capped it tightly. Her hands were trembling slightly from the cold, but she welcomed the sensation. The body stayed sharper when chilled, slower to burn resources, less prone to misjudgment. Heat induced mistakes. Cold induced calculation. The sky above remained clear, the stars unmoving. The moons of Thalus X hadn't risen yet, leaving the night deep and unrelenting. Yet in this darkness, there were small glimmers, glints of foil, huddled figures, quiet breath. The desert had gone from silence to rhythm. Erin sat again and pulled out a scrap of paper she had written on the night before. She turned it over and scribbled a new note. Phase 2 working, foil slope, 35 degrees. Best output at wind-facing axis. Peak yield after 2 a.m. She underlined the last phrase. It meant she had to stay awake. Around her, the other cadets had stopped collapsing. Now they watched. Some had even moved closer, careful not to cross into her workspace. The feathered cadet maintained a quiet distance, but offered nods when their eyes met. The quadruped had begun gathering stones with his rear legs and pushing them toward the basin edge for extra weight. The reptilian cadet rested beside his trap, head low, arms crossed, waiting for his first drop. Not one word passed between them, yet a strange cohesion had begun to form. Not a team, not a tribe. Just a web of understanding shaped not by technology or speech, but by imitation and mutual necessity. As the second hour of night deepened, the air grew colder, and the stars seemed to throb against the velvet sky. Erin's traps filled slowly. She counted 17 drops in her main basin. She stored them. She checked the others, smaller yields but functional. She rotated the cloth in one, used her breath to warm another, and shifted the weight on the north-facing pit. Then she sat back. One by one, the cadets followed her lead. They adjusted their designs, rotated cloths, mimicked gestures. Some failed. Others succeeded modestly. It didn't matter. The shift had already occurred. At some point, just past 3 a.m., the Zalari cadet lifted her head and looked at Erin. "You are not afraid," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I am cautious," Erin replied softly. The cadet tilted her head. "But not afraid." Erin didn't answer. Instead, she leaned forward and added a few more words to her note. "Fear wastes energy. Precision saves life." Then she tucked the paper into her jacket, stood slowly, and checked the traps one more time. The cold was harsh now. Her fingers ached, and her lips had cracked further. But she had enough liquid to survive until sunrise. She glanced around the small crescent of figures crouched near makeshift basins. Some had fire in their eyes again, dull, quiet determination. Others still looked hollow, but stayed near the warmth of effort. None had collapsed since sunset. When she finally sat again, she allowed herself a single sip. Just one. It tasted like metal and dust and sky. But it was hers, and she had earned it. By the time the first pale rays of sun split the horizon, Erin had already packed her traps and buried the used cloth to preserve its moisture. She worked in silence, her fingers stiff from the cold, but her movements deliberate and practiced. A soft wind curled over the sand, dry and whispering, and it brought with it a sense of the inevitable. Heat was coming, fast and punishing. She stood and scanned the small perimeter of traps around her. 4 were her own. 3 were crude imitations built by cadets she had not spoken to. Yet those cadets now guarded their makeshift basins with quiet intensity, shielding them from the rising light with slabs of rock or shadowed cloth. The night had changed them. The desert had begun its teaching, not with lectures or alerts, but with silence, scarcity, and slow salvation. The feathered cadet had not slept. He crouched by his basin, adjusting the cloth with sharp, trembling fingers. When the foil shifted in the wind, he pinned it down with a fragment of bone he had found nearby. His eyes darted between his work and Erin, as if seeking reassurance without asking. She gave him none, but he seemed steadier now, driven more by observation than desperation. The reptilian cadet stood at the edge of the dune, his head lifted toward the east, his scales reflecting orange light. His trap had not produced much, but it had yielded enough to keep him moving. He hadn't spoken either, but his posture was more upright now. He carried the discipline of someone who had tasted failure and decided not to repeat it. Erin knelt beside her main basin and extracted the final drops into a vial. She drank it without ceremony. Her throat welcomed the warmth, and her body, despite fatigue, felt grounded. She had learned long ago not to celebrate small victories. Just recognize them, log them, and build upon them. Around mid-morning, a shimmer rose on the far side of the basin. A figure emerged, tall, angular, with a draped cloak scorched along one side. The cadet's gait was labored. His hydration suit had ruptured along the seams, and his skin, pale and semi-translucent, was flecked with dust. He paused halfway down the slope, swaying. Then he dropped to one knee. Erin stood. She hesitated. She had no extra water, no remaining cloth, and no materials for another trap. But she did have a trench dug nearby from her second failed attempt the night before. It had remained shaded for hours. She moved toward the trench, uncovered it, and gestured to the cadet to come forward. He crawled now, inch by inch, until he reached the shaded pit. She helped him inside, then tore a strip from her inner shirt and soaked it with the remaining condensation on the inner wall. She pressed it gently to his lips. He didn't resist. His eyes closed as the moisture touched his tongue. "Breathe through your nose," she said softly. "Don't talk." He nodded faintly. His shoulders dropped. The wind picked up again, pushing coarse sand in slow waves across the flat terrain. The sun was fully overhead now. and the ground shimmered with dry light. The other cadets had begun building windbreaks, crude shapes made from scavenged ration panels, broken foil, and even their own torn uniforms. Erin noticed how they had begun copying her structure from the first day, not just in function, but in discipline. She watched one cadet wipe his hands clean before adjusting a cloth angle, careful not to damage the fabric with oily fingers. She watched another dig a deeper pit, his motion slow, rhythmic. The Zalari cadet had become more mobile. She now carried her own foil in one arm, helping another cadet construct a mirrored shelter. She had not spoken since the night, but when her eyes met Erin's, something unspoken passed between them. Gratitude, yes, but more than that, mutual certainty. In the late afternoon, the sun burned white above the horizon. The air rippled with radiated heat, and distant dunes seemed to melt into one another. A few cadets had begun murmuring to themselves again. Those who had not joined the trap network, those who had clung to tech that now sat in melted pieces beside their bodies. One cadet, a pale, serpentine female with 4 lenses for eyes, sat beneath a fractured canopy. Her tongue darted out rapidly, a sign of escalating dehydration. Erin approached cautiously, offering her own shadow as brief respite. She knelt, examined the cadet's limbs. Pulse faint, eyes dry, skin dry, suit ruptured, no trap, no container. Erin returned to her pack and retrieved a palm-sized scrap of foil she had been saving to patch a torn shoe. It would do better here. She wrapped it into a cone, poured 2 drops of her collected water into it, and returned to the cadet. Without speaking, she held the cone to the cadet's mouth. The cadet did not resist. She took the water with a flick of her tongue and curled into herself, less rigid now. Erin shaded her with her own scarf for a few minutes until her breathing slowed. Then Erin rose and walked back to her camp. She didn't expect applause. She didn't need it. The traps had now spread across the slope, more than a dozen. Each was slightly different, adjusted by the species that built them. One had vertical spines added to catch wind more directly. Another used skin-shed resin for anchoring. Some were elegant, some barely held shape, but they worked. In the silence between gusts of wind, there were now sounds of shifting stones, of foil fluttering, of footsteps not driven by panic, but by method. The desert had stripped every cadet down to instinct, and in that emptiness, Erin's design had not merely saved lives, it had restructured the entire logic of survival on Thalus X. As the sun dropped again toward the western rim, shadows lengthened. Cadets began anchoring their traps for the next night. Those who still had energy helped others. The feathered cadet offered his last intact cord to the reptilian, who used it to secure a larger canopy. The quadruped lay beside Erin's original basin, eyes closed, limbs tucked, breathing calm. Even the cadet in the trench had managed to stand again. When the wind shifted cooler and the first stars appeared, Erin sat beside her main pit. She unwrapped the cloth from her arms and stretched her fingers, stiff and raw from digging. She stared up at the sky, the air now colder than stone, and for the first time since her arrival on Thalus X, she allowed herself a single thought, not of survival but of quiet pride. She had not told anyone what to do. She had not issued commands, drafted rules, or broadcast orders. She had simply survived with clarity, and in the space her clarity had opened, others had chosen to follow, not from obligation, but because survival had demanded it. She closed her eyes, felt the cold seep into her bones, and whispered beneath her breath, "The desert never shouts, but it teaches everything." The second dawn on Thalus X arrived not with majesty but with muted weight. The wind whispered through half-built shelters and over hardened foil, tugging gently at corners staked with rock and claw. The sand no longer shimmered with menace. It had dulled, settled, accepted the presence of life that had neither conquered it nor fled. Erin sat upright before the first light touched her, her legs tucked beneath her, arms folded against the cold. She had slept in fragments, brief 10-minute dips into near consciousness between checking her traps and tending to those who had come closer during the night. The reptilian cadet now slept in a curl beside his 4th dew trap, one clawed arm draped loosely across his chest. The feathered cadet lay nearby, wings wrapped around his torso like a shroud. The Zalari cadet, silent since yesterday afternoon, sat upright beside her foil, eyes half closed but alert. The desert had not broken her, It had hollowed her out, and she had filled the space with patience. Erin rose slowly, brushing dust from her scarf. Her joints creaked, her legs ached, her lips were dry again, but the pain was tolerable. She moved to the largest pit and uncapped the vial tucked into the hollow of the stone. 7 drops, not much, but it was enough to split between 3. She poured it into a flattened dish and walked toward the feathered cadet. When he stirred, she handed it to him without speaking. He took it, nodded, then passed it wordlessly to the reptilian cadet. The reptilian cadet looked at her, but said nothing. He simply drank and handed it back. The Zalari cadet declined with a gesture. Above them, a low humming began to pulse through the air. She froze. Others lifted their heads slowly. The sound wasn't natural. It wasn't wind or drone or predator. It was deep and mechanical, full of rhythm and propulsion. She stepped onto the rise above the dew pits and narrowed her eyes. From beyond the southern dune line, a transport vessel approached. Military model, dull gray, wide wings, slow rotation thrusters. Its presence didn't alarm her, but the timing surprised her. She thought she had another 6 hours before retrieval. She turned to face the rest of the cadets now stirring beneath the sun. Some covered their eyes. Others stood with effort. A few stared blankly, too exhausted to react. The vessel circled once, then descended just outside the original drop zone. Its hatch remained closed for almost a full minute, as if someone were watching first. Then the ramp opened with a hydraulic hiss. From inside, 3 instructors stepped down. One bipedal with elongated sensory limbs, another crystalline, and the third a human woman in a gray flight suit with the emblem of the Galactic Survival Academy on her chest. Her expression was unreadable behind dark lenses. She approached the nearest cadet and scanned him with a handheld bioanalyzer. The device blinked yellow. Not critical. The crystalline instructor walked directly toward Erin's cluster of pits. He stopped beside the deepest one, bent slightly at the waist and ran his hand just above the edge, careful not to disturb the foil. He straightened slowly and turned to the human instructor. She extracted water without tech, he said in his fractured tone. Every drop was atmospheric. She stabilized 7 cadets, the human instructor added, reviewing her datapad. Without issuing commands, no emergency beacon, no attempt at extraction. The bipedal instructor spoke last. She converted desert exposure into a cooperative survival node using instinctive engineering. No casualties in her proximity. Dozens more failed with full tech access. The human instructor lowered her datapad and approached Erin. Name? She asked flatly. Erin Salazar, Erin said. Her voice was hoarse but steady. The instructor nodded. Your design will be submitted to the Atmospheric Emergency Curriculum for review. We will tag it under your name, unless you prefer anonymity. Erin shook her head. Put it on the record. The instructor reached into her utility belt and pulled out a circular patch, marked with a minimalist emblem. 2 interlocking shapes that resembled foil and stone. She extended it toward Erin. Erin didn't move. What's that for? She asked. Protocol Edition Token, the instructor replied. Rarely issued. Awarded when survival outcomes are redefined by cadet innovation. Erin took it without a word and placed it inside her jacket. The other cadets remained quiet, standing in loose formation. No one clapped. No one cheered. But glances passed from one face to another. The reptilian cadet looked at her with narrowed eyes, not cold, not skeptical, simply seeing. The feathered cadet tilted his head once. The Zalari cadet lifted her chin and placed her hand over her chest. The instructors moved to the next cluster, scanning bodies, confirming vitals. 2 cadets were escorted onto the ship immediately, too weak to walk. Others followed in silence. Erin waited until her group was last. She stood at the rear, hands behind her back, her scarf still tight around her face. As she reached the ramp, the crystalline instructor paused and looked back over the dunes. You know, he said, not turning to face her, we modeled this desert after the old ones. Earth's Sahara, Chile's Atacama, Mars' first domeless trials. Most cadets forget the desert wasn't always conquered by machines. It used to demand respect. Erin looked past him, her gaze resting on the shallow pits now abandoned in the sand. It still does, she said quietly. Inside the ship, she found a seat in the rear and placed her pack on her lap. The others filled in slowly, some asleep before liftoff. No one looked at her directly, but they didn't ignore her either. She had shifted from stranger to Axis, not through force, not through speech, but by kneeling before the wind and listening. The hatch sealed, the vessel lifted. Through the small round window beside her, Aaron watched the desert shrink beneath them, an expanse of quiet devastation that had once promised death but now held the echo of droplets in foil. The sand would cover the traps. The wind would erase the pits, but the desert would remember, and so would those who survived it.